Welcome to the February meeting of the Bay Area Culinary Historians. This evening, we are very pleased to have with us Adam Balic. Adam Balic is an immunologist and independent scholar. Professionally, he has taught and researched immunology in the UK and Australia. Born and raised in Australia, his first postdoctoral position placed him in Scotland, where he lived for over 2 decades. While living there, he developed a special interest in Scottish food and history, Scottish food history, and British food history in general. He has been a committee member of the Leeds Symposium on Food History and Traditions, presented papers on Scottish food traditions at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, and is co-author of Food on the Move, Dining on the Legendary Railway Journeys of the World. Currently living and working in Australia, he is presently researching the history and cultural impact of the British Savoury course. Please join us in welcoming Adam Balic.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. First of all, please let me know if you can see this.
Looks good.
Yep, great, perfect. Here we go. So, as Andrew said, we'll be talking today about the Savoury course. And sorry, I'm just adjusting you all out of the way. Perfect. Essentially, it's a fascinating area of research for food historians and cultural historians. It is a very, very English food cultural icon, and there's a lot of misconceptions about it. So I thought we'd dive into the history of it, and I'll pose some questions about where we think the future of it could be going. So, as Andrew said, I was born and raised in Australia. I was actually raised in rural southern Australia. So you can see here in this map of Australia, there's a red dot marking where I grew up, and there's even a photograph of where I grew up. And as you can see, it's fairly flat and featureless. Now, this must be a new photograph, because if my grandfather had seen that tree, he would have chopped it down. So I was inspired to leave this area. And on the completion of my PhD in veterinary science, I moved to Edinburgh. Now, this was meant to be for a 2-year postdoc, but I ended up staying there for just over 20 years and raised my 2 children there. So while I was in Edinburgh, it's a very historic city, and I developed a great interest in the local food. So what are savouries, and particularly what is a savoury course? So savouries are really defined as small piquant dishes that they're there to stimulate the appetite. They're not designed to provide nourishment. They are there to provide interest to the evening, and especially they're there to be eaten with alcoholic drinks. Now, in a formal British meal, the savoury course was served towards the conclusion of the meal, so between the sweet course and the dessert. Okay, and this is important because in this context, the dessert, until recently, has meant the conclusion of the meal, or literally the deserting of the table. And the dessert in this context is just very simple things like some nuts or some fruit. It wasn't what we now consider to be the dessert, which is all the sweet things in one course. Okay, and this is in terms of savouries, this has caused some confusion because now dessert is synonymous with the sweet course. It's led to this idea that savouries were eaten instead of or as an alternative to the sweet course. They were actually that was not the intention. It may have been the case where people decided that they didn't want to eat the sweet course and waited for the savouries to arrive, but that wasn't the intention of the structure of the meal. Okay, they weren't a replacement for sweet things at all. So in terms of the timeline of the development of savouries, really the first descriptions as savouries as a distinct class of of dishes really was coming out in the 1860s. From the 1860s, we see the emergence of the savory course in formal English dinners. And really the peak popularity of savories and the savory course was that 50 years between the 1880s and the 1930s. It wasn't a static process, although American drinks had been introduced into Britain by at least the 1870s. Really, when the cocktail culture took off, that had an effect of uncoupling savories from the savory course itself. So the savories were no longer confined to that course. They were associated with cocktails and drinking. During the 1940s, like a lot of foodways, because of the Second World War and onwards, post the Second World War, we really saw the decline of savories, and especially the savory course. And the savory course, apart from a few august organizations, really disappeared. So it went from one of the most popular dining experiences in the UK to almost extinct within a couple of decades. During that period, essentially savories, they went into all male spaces or elite spaces like university college dinners, all men's clubs and shooting lodges. And then finally, from the 1980s to now, we have this periodic revival of savories. So people suggest, oh, why aren't we eating savories? They were fantastic. They were so delicious and they were so British. Why aren't we eating those? And that happens periodically once every 3 or 4 years. And it never quite gets there in terms of a revival. And we'll go into why that is later in the discussion. So here are some examples of savories that I've cooked over the last few years. And really they cover one area of savories, which is small piquant dishes that are served on pieces of bread so that they're easy to eat. And they should be, and classically, when people talk about savories, they talk about these small dishes. But we'll see later that that's actually not necessarily the case for savories in general. So we can see here some fairly classic savories like Scotch woodcock and deviled chicken livers. Those are dishes that pre-existed the savory course and savories in general. We see some things that were specifically invented but as a savory dish. So we have this on the bottom left, we have these canapes Cadogan, which was invented by Escoffier. That's essentially a Florentine in that it's a bed of spinach on a crouton with poached oysters covered in a Mornay sauce and then grilled. And then we have some more elaborate dishes that could be covered. They could also appear as hors d'oeuvres. So in that category, we have things like the Lux à la Russe and the marinated herrings à la Connaught. Okay, so these are cold dishes, and a lot of savories were actually cold dishes, and they could appear easily as an hors d'oeuvre as well. So in a separate part of the meal. So the idea was that these dishes weren't necessarily completely restricted to a particular course, but they were always piquant and stimulating dishes. And they appeared not just in Australia, in Britain, been back too long. They're also in the colonies, of which Australia was one. So at the top here, we have something called the Indian toasts. And these were basically shrimp that were cooked in a curry-flavored butter and placed on a crouton that had been spread with chutney. And so, although savories, and especially the savory courses, thought as a particularly English habit, it did spread wider into the British-dominated colonies. But really, it didn't really spread out with the British sphere of influence. So savory's never caught on in America, for instance. And here I thought I'd give some examples of menus. So this is a very high status Masonic dinner from 1906. It's a very nice menu. It's in courses. Each course has a very specific set of dishes. But importantly, if we see the end of the menu, we can see that the savories, which is that canapé Ivanhoe, which is creamed smoked haddock on a crouton, is sandwiched between the sweet course and the desserts. Now, and in this case, the dessert is not listed because the dessert was considered to be outside the meal, really, and is often not listed and itemized. But we can see here there's a comment referring to cheese. So the dessert here probably is cheese and some nuts and some fruit. So you've just finished your vanilla bavois, and then you think, right, I would really fancy a piece of toast with some creamed smoked haddock on it. Now it seems very strange now, but that is almost every menu from this era, and there's a reason for that, because these events were associated with heavy drinking, and really what those savories were for was to continue the drinking. We have another two fairly elite menus here. They're not quite as elaborate. The one on the left is the Royal Academy Students' Dinner from 1902. And we can see here, after the sweets, again, we have the savory, which is, in this case, is cod roes on toast. And we also have the Scottish Annual Butchers Association dinner of 1923. And although the courses aren't listed here, we can see that after the ice cream bomb and the wafers, there's the Croûte Ivanhoe appearing. Now that is, and then that's followed by coffee. So in that case, the dessert's not listed, and simply the dessert is coffee. So in what all these have in common is that the savory is appearing after the sweet course. Okay, and that is very unusual in most dining cultures. That really makes savory stand out from almost every other food habit. Now, you can still get savories. Now I'm going to talk about how savories are extinct and gone and finished, but actually they still are available in restaurants in London. So this is Sweetings, and Sweetings started off life as a fishmonger near the old Billingsgate fish market near Cheapside. Now it is evolved itself into a fish restaurant, and the interior is still pretty much the old Edwardian interior. It's a special place, and it's unusual in that rather than having large numbers of tables to sit at, most diners actually sit at the bench that runs the whole perimeter of the restaurant. So you're facing not towards your dining partner unless you turn sideways on your seat. Now you can see here that again, after the puddings, we have some savories. So buck rabbit and Welsh rabbit. Buck rabbit is simply Welsh rabbit with an egg on it. We have some cheese and again, roes on toast. So roes, either hard roes, which are basically things like cod's roe, which is the egg sacs, or soft roes, which are the semen storage units in herring or mackerel, were incredibly popular as a savory. And these are probably herring roes, soft melts. So where do these savories and the savory course come from? Well, to understand that, we really have to consider how dining changed so radically during the 19th century. And essentially what we're talking about is the old formal service, which in its latest form was called service à la française into service à la Russe. And to illustrate the changes here, I've got two images which are roughly contemporary, like they're within half a decade of each other, these images. On the left, we see a sort of a typical course laid for service à la Française, and we would call that now a banquet or a family style, okay? Everything is on the table together. We can see a pineapple and some fruit. We can see some cakes. There are some jellies in there, but there are also piles of oyster patties. There are sandwiches. There is a veal galantine. Okay, so what we have here in this course is all the food on the table at once and a mixture of sweet and savory items. Whereas in the progression to service à la Russe, those courses were changed. We had a demarcation between sweet and savory items, and rather than the food being placed on the table at the beginning of service or before service, diners were presented with food which were individually then plated for them. And when service à la Russe was introduced, it led to, as you can see on this table by comparing the two images, an enormous proliferation in silver cutlery. Okay, because every course had its own set of tableware. And what that meant is that service à la Russe was an elite way of eating. Okay, so only the most wealthy households and organizations could participate in hosting events in this manner in the beginning. Okay, so there's a social cachet here to being able to put all the silver and silverware on the table, and also the massive increase in the amount of staff required to pull off a meal like this. So if we want to understand where savories come from, we need to go back a little bit from that time. And so this is two menus from the beginning of the 19th century. And so these happen to be Scottish menus. Excuse me. And although when we're talking about service à la Française, it's often stated that there was two courses and a dessert, but really things were more flexible than that. And so I've given an example here of from the same book, two different menus. What's useful about these images is it shows you the placement of individual items on the dining table. Okay, so on the left, we have a family dinner. It's a single course. It's still dining à la Française. You have all the things placed on the table at once. There are, in terms of sweet items, there is something called a remove, which is apple pie. Now, in the middle of the table, at the beginning of the meal, there was a big tureen of hotchpotch, which was a soup. When that was removed, it was replaced with an apple pie. So people were eating roast beef and pickles, and maybe picking at a piece of lobster with a salmon with lobster sauce, and they could have helped themselves to some apple pie at the same time if they so choose. In a more conventional menu layout, we can see that there's two courses here on the right. We're separating out things like fish and roast meats in the first course. From the second course is there are more smaller items and roast game, so duckling, for instance. But in that second course, we see an almond cream, a ratafia cream. So another sweet item placed on the table in the middle near some veal cutlets. Now, after that second course, then we come to the dessert. And the dessert there is very simple. It's cut rummers refer to the glassware rather than a dish. Rennets, walnuts, Spanish nuts or olives, and pears. Dessert is simply fruit and some nuts, okay, and some water. And it's really about ending the meal. In the course of the 19th century, while dining habits were transitioning from service à la Française to service à la Russe, the structure of the food courses changed. So no longer is everything being piled in together. We're starting to see separate courses emerge of similar items. Okay. And one of those courses was the entremet. Okay. And so historically, entremet has meant many different things, but in Britain in the 19th century, up until the middle of the 19th century, what it really meant was that the second course dishes, large pieces of meat, all the things that go as side dishes. So it could have been essentially anything except for soup or meat. Now, we can see here in this description from The Modern Cook by Francatelli, we can see that there are jellies and creams, there are dressed eggs, there are scalloped shellfish, there are dressed vegetables. All of those things are entremet, and they would have been all on the table together under the old service a la Francaise. We can see now in this very, very high status menu on the right that they're now a separate course. So in practice, all the vegetables, entremets, are still served as side dishes to the meat. Now, if we break down this menu, we can see it's very high status. The queen's son is the chair of the meal. It's a very, very grand meal for raising money for some orphans. And that's very high Victorian. Now, we can see the menu starts with soup, and then the fish course, and then entrees, and then the réveillé, which are the large cuts of meat, often roasted, which is confusing because the next course is roasted meats, but the roast course only referred to roast game. So domestic birds that were roasted went into the previous course. Okay. And then we have the entremet, and then dessert. Okay, so we have between the main savory dishes and the dessert, we have this entremet course. And if we look at that in a bit more detail, we can see that most of the dishes in this particular example are sweet, but there are two savory items there. So we have this talmouse, which is a triangular cheese pie, and we have some canapes. Okay, so at this point on this menu, we're seeing a separation of the menu into discrete courses, but we still have a mixture of savory and sweet things immediately before the dessert. Now, it seems fairly simple that there was just a further development, which was separating out that entremet course into a sweet entremets, which became the sweet course, and savory entremets, which became the savory course. And really, that's the central idea of how people think about how the savory course developed. But it's not really that simple. And the reason for that is because if we actually look at what entremets were, they weren't these small piquant dishes designed to stimulate appetite. I mean, we have this example here on the right. We can see that it's pasta, it's omelets. There are a few things that could qualify as a modern savory, so poached eggs with anchovy toast. But then we have salads and gnocchi. We have things that just for most people now would not qualify as a savory dish. And so what does this tell us? That it tells us that the evolution of the savory course is more complex than simply a change in dining habit and a differentiation of courses. So if we look back to any precedents for savories, we can see some interesting things happening in the beginning of the 19th century. So if a cheese course was served during a formal British meal, it was served after the sweet course, and it either preceded dessert or it replaced dessert. Okay, and that really is a space that's occupied by the savory course later on. So simply, it could simply be that, there was things that got served with cheese, and they ended up being the savory course as well, and they got folded into the entremets. Okay, and we can see some evidence for that. So we can see that in Eliza Aiken's Modern Cookery for Private Families, perhaps the most important mid-century cookbook in England. She has a description of things that we can knock together to serve with the cheese course. So she's calling them, she has savory toasts here. And, those savory toasts, you could put all manner of things on them. She's suggesting here minced truffles with stewed in butter with some shallots. And generally, people like eating cheese and like eating truffles, it turns out. So we have what would here. Sorry, I'm getting some messages up about controlling the presentation. Right. So we have here what are basically savories. And what's important is that these savories are being served in a space where there's both men and women. Okay, because women were still at the table for the cheese course. And why is that important? Well, it's important because that wasn't always the case for food and dining in Britain in the first half of the 19th century and prior to that. So we have a comment here, and again from a Scottish cookbook. It talks about zests, and zests are put down after dessert is removed. Okay, and we look at this list of zests, and it's devilled poultry and game, anchovy toast, anchovies, caviar, olives, devilled biscuits, oysters, and grated meat. These are essentially classic savories. But they're appearing 2 or 3 generations before the savory course. So what's happening here? Why aren't these things? Why isn't a savory course existing at this point when clearly the savory foods are? And the reason for that is because of when they were served and to whom they were served. Okay, so we have more of these descriptions of zests. Okay, and zests are, and we can see that this is from, again, a Scottish cookbook, 1827, and a later one from the colonies, so 1860. So, over a 30-year period. And essentially, they're considered an important part of the meal. There's pages and pages of recipes for these zests, these things that are served after dessert. Now, the clue is when they're being served. Okay, so we have this essentially etiquette book, and it's talking about zests are served at the close of dessert, and it gives a description of what they are. They consist of anchovy toast, biscuits, deviled game, poultry, and grills, all those things that we think of as being sort of savories now. But they're served to the men because the women had already left the table. So these items were not savories because savories were in the late 19th century were available to both sexes. In the beginning of the 19th century, the same food items under a different name served in a different part of the meal were exclusively for men. And we can see how this evolved here, and some more detail here about the meaning in context of zest. So when we talk about zest now, we largely talk about the outer surface of a citrus fruit, or somebody that has a great enthusiasm for life. But its meaning is a little bit more subtle and different in the 18th century and the early 19th century. So in Samuel Johnson's dictionary, not only was the zest the peel of an orange, but it's very specifically the peel of an orange that is squeezed into wine. Another meaning of zest is to provide relish, or to heighten relish by adding something. And the reason for this is because one of the main purposes of zests were associated with flavoring wine. So in this case, this Hogarth image here, I've highlighted two areas of this fairly debauched, male-dominated after dinner gathering. We can see in the middle a large punch bowl, and if you look carefully, you can see some orange peel that is draped over the edge of the punch bowl. And on the floor, near this unfortunate gentleman on the ground, we can see some more orange peels and some empty bottles. So these are discarded orange peels. So when people were talking about zest to end a meal in the 19th century and producing things like anchovy toast and devil bones, etc., they were doing that in reference to the knowledge that zest meant enhancing the experience of drinking wine. So associating those items with drinking alcohol. Now, the issue here is that these were male spaces. So again, if we look at the beginning of the middle of the 19th century, we look at another etiquette book. It gives a very detailed description of expectations. Essentially, once the dinner has reached the dessert, the ladies retire to the drawing room, and then the door to the dining room is then shut. The men all bunch up on the seats that the women have removed themselves from, and they continue to drink while the ladies are in the drawing room. Now, the issue with this, and this is when they would have been eating all those zests, all those spicy foods, all those devil bones, all those devil biscuits and caviars and anchovy toast. This is a space where they're consuming those items. Okay, the women were next door, and if they were lucky, they got some cake. Now, a lot of women at the period did not like this and spoke about what a horrific time of any meal, formal meal this, and they absolutely dreaded it, because essentially they had to make small talk late at night on subjects that people thought were fit for women in their level of society. Meanwhile, their men were drinking and eating next door, possibly for hours. So the reward from removing yourself from the room was to get a drunken husband smelling of devil bones and anchovies to take home. So women did not like this. A lot of men didn't like it. And there we have here the change with savories, because savories, despite having a very masculine overtone, when the savory course developed with the adoption of service à la Russe, suddenly savories, all those piquant items, they appeared between the sweets and the dessert. So the women were still in the room. So suddenly women were at the same table, whereas where these food items that they'd formerly been excluded from. Now, this didn't suit everybody, because a lot of men wanted to drink heavily and eat these savory items. And a lot of women were not interested in watching this. But nevertheless, it meant that the change in dining and service meant there was a change in the way that people were interacting together between men and women. And that led to an enormous popularity in savories. So for centuries, men had been drinking and eating things like bataga and anchovy toast and grilled cheese, and nobody cared. Suddenly, when we had a more democratic dining experience with men and women together, those items became enormously interesting. To summarize this section of the talk, so the emergence of the savory course and savories as a separate food item is really quite complex. They're an amalgam of many things. So those drinking dishes that many cultures have. Possibly some of these items that appeared in a cheese course, the savory entremets that hitherto had been sort of side dishes. All these come together at the end of the 19th century to form the savory course. So now we're really talking about peak savory, 50 years, 1880 to the 1930s, where when this particular way of eating and these particular food items were enormously popular. So the first book dedicated to savories was produced by Harriet Ann DeSellis, or more popularly known as Mrs. DeSellis, in 1877. Now, a lot of these dishes are that she lists are actually the previous drinking dishes of another generation. So, but now they're coming into the female sphere, okay, and they no longer have quite as much association with drinking culture. Okay, so we see the emergence of some new things as well. So she has the first recipe in English for angels on horseback, which people still eat now. That recipe had only appeared a few years earlier in Dubois' 1872 French cookbook. And this image here of the angels on horseback is his recipe. And just as an aside, it explains a lot about this particular dish. Dubois had a habit of describing anything on top of anything else as a cheval or astride or on horseback. So in this case, we have a skewer of oysters with bacon on top of a crouton. So it's on horseback, not because it's a skewer of oysters, but because it's on top of that crouton. The crouton has mostly been lost now, and so the sense of the meaning has disappeared as well. Why are they called angels? I can only speculate, but in the early recipe that he produced, the oysters are not wrapped in bacon, but interspersed with small pieces of bacon. And when these are grilled, they fold out like angel wings. So we have this interesting thing, and really DeSellis's book is the seminal book on savories, but it also is incredibly relevant now. It still has most of modern savories that are still made within it. Now we can break down DeSellis's book and we can see these different elements of the history of this course coming together. So she has things like devil biscuits in this case, which part of that pre-19th century drinking culture. She has very strange things like macaroni with tomato sauce, and we're talking about a pound of macaroni here. This is not a small piquant dish, okay? This is a large portion of something. So although people, and I here have spoken about savories as being small piquant dishes that are designed to stimulate the appetite, that was never the case, even from the very beginning of the savory course. Because essentially it's incorporating these quite big side dishes from the earlier entremet course. And now she's on trend here. She's getting sort of things that are of the latest interest. So she's introduced new items like angels on horseback, and you can see that her recipe, though it's still on a crouton, she's now wrapping the oysters and bacon. So she has what we now think of as the more modern sort of presentation. So we have these different elements of the savory course coming together, and there is still a strong association with drinking, and still a strong association with small piquant dishes. And that was a problem because some people absolutely hated savories and the savory course, but it was an enormously popular. So this is a very, very British thing, and to be fair to say, the savory course is almost entirely an English phenomena. And Americans were confused by it. The French just thought it was the worst possible thing they'd ever seen. even a lot of British people just could not understand why this food trend was so popular, but it had legs. And so we're talking about 50 years of people insisting on having a savory or savory course as part of a formal meal. So chefs were fairly resigned, but they would like to make a statement. So Escoffier, perhaps the most important chef of the early 20th century, in his magnus opus of the Guide Culinaire, he gives over 50 recipes for savories. He is very unhappy about it, though. And in the very first line of the preface to the savory chapter, he talks about how they should not be included in any classical menu. We have another comment here from Charles Herman Sen, who was a prolific teacher and author of cooking. And he's more nuanced. He doesn't object so much to savories, but he's very aware that a lot of people do. So he's saying here that, you know, there's an expectation that savories are associated with overindulgence and especially over drinking, and that for that reason, many women, although savories are offered to them, so they're no longer excluded from these dishes, they're still refusing them because essentially these dishes are associated with hard drinking by drunken men at the end of a meal. And then we have George Augustus Sala, who was a very prolific journalist and an author. And in this book, he devotes an entire essay to why savories are appalling. His statement is at the top of this slide where it says, why do you eat them? Why? Why do people eat them? And he goes and tells us why we shouldn't be eating them and how they destroy any sense of taste for, you know, a beautiful English apple or a pineapple or wine. They're terrible things to have within the meal. But again, he has to conclude that people are just going to eat them. So, and I'm not going to tell them, it's a thankless task telling people not to eat them. So again, I make them and I serve them, but I hate them. So it's a very, very interesting position for any food author to be writing recipes for food items that they actually loathe. You know, imagine doing that now. But one of the things that kept the popularity of savories was not so much the savory course, which, reading between the lines, was often horrific because of the excess drinking and the exclusion, still the social exclusion by women, but was the introduction of the American drinking culture. So cocktails, so American drinks had entered into London, and by about the 1870s. So we start to see the emergence of American bars and American drinks start appearing in English cookbooks. And, you know, that separated savory dishes from the savory course because people were drinking cocktails and they wanted to eat something with them. And so in some of the most important books on that were published on savories, by which time there were many dozen books published on savories specifically, we see this, you know, in Dorothy Olhausen, who was an elite hostess. She in her book Unusual Savories, she talks about in these cocktail days, when savories are in so much in demand. You know, here is another book on them. Like, there've been many books written, but here's another one because, you know, we're all drinking cocktails and we all want something to eat with them. And we also have another book here, Good Housekeeping, not quite as an elite, but again, it talks about savories and separating out savories from the savory course, because in here they're describing how, look, you've been to the theater, you've been out, you've invited people back for cocktails or some drinks. They want to eat something, so why not give them some savories? Okay, so savories by the 1920s, 1930s were now out with the formal dinner. Okay, so they were becoming atomized. They were spreading to the four winds. Wherever people were drinking and wanted to eat something delicious and snacky, there was a savory to be had. Now, what do these savories look like? Well, we actually have quite a few bits of direct evidence of what the savories actually looked like, because people took photographs. Okay, so we're no longer confined to the area of descriptions or prints. We've got actual photographic evidence of what these items look like. And black and white photographs of food are never that inspiring, but they're interesting dishes. They give us the impression of what they are. They're small, they're bite size, they're easy to eat in general. That's not always the case. So we can see at the top we have eggs and anchovies. This is a chicken's egg. It's a pullet's egg. It's a small chicken's egg. This is not a simple mouthful. You're not going to be able to comfortably eat that while sipping a cocktail while walking around the room. For a long time, I couldn't work out what those eggs were meant to represent, but I've now worked out that they are actually meant to look like wine barrels. And the little dot of truffle is meant to be the wine bung. So there you go. There is another explicit association of these savories with drinking culture. And, they look fairly innocuous, right? They don't look particularly aggressive, and they don't look like they don't look so hateful. But it was the association of how they were consumed that was problematic for people. And actually, cocktails was a solution to this, essentially because people that didn't want to go out and drink cocktails didn't do it, so they never got exposed to these savories and the culture of drinking cocktails with these specific types of food. Whereas when they were forced to sit down at a table together, they were. And I guess we come to the end of this era, and really it was the peak of the savories, and especially savories with cocktails, was really coincided with the emergence of the Second World War. So savories had sailed through the First World War without any lack of interest. But the Second World War was different. And a lot of food cultural effects were impacted in Britain. Firstly, because there was less choice, and savories just weren't available for well over a decade. There were frivolities, they were always seen as a bit of an elite item. So the idea that people would be indulging in savories during the war or during the rationing years was difficult for many people. Okay, and so they were very slow to come out of this because they are seen as an elite item. The other thing is that food habits change. So here we have a book of Mediterranean cooking by Elizabeth David, published in 1953. People didn't look back. People were looking elsewhere for inspiration with food. They weren't necessarily looking towards Britishness or British culture and British food ways when food started coming back and choices started coming back. So the effect of these two dynamics was fairly simple, is that savory sort of retreated back into niche areas. They, instead of being part of a formal course, they really, in most sort of public meals, they disappeared, and they really became sort of an elite item. So you'd see a savory during the last half of the 20th century, maybe on a very formal university dinner, at certain gentlemen's clubs, at certain restaurants that wanted to get a particular idea of tradition and Englishness. You rarely saw them habitually. On the other hand, we still had items called savouries. And this continued really up until the beginning of the 20th century. So this is my mother's cookbook. And it's the Australian Women's Weekly. It's a softcover cookbook. They were hugely popular. They were available in every newsagents. It have a savory section. It talks about them that they are there to be made with drinks. Okay, it's the 90s. 90s was in Australia was aspirational. We can see some. I'm sure that my mother never made these because I can't remember it, and there's no food splatters on the pages. But we can see here mini pizzas, Mexican turnovers. We can see chicken wings. We can see an eel spread. These are aspirational foods for publicly dining and hosting. Okay, and this is where savouries lingered on. Okay, they were completely divorced now from the idea of a formal meal, but we had to have some word for these small, interesting bits of food that go with drinks. So we're almost going back to the 18th century here in that these savouries are now purely associated with drinking culture and entertainment rather than a part of a formal meal. And really, every few years, there's an attempt at a revival. Okay, so what we see here is some clips I've taken from over the last 20 years from various newspapers, where there's an article about, do you know, savouries are really delicious, and I really like savouries. Why don't we revive those again? Okay, and it never happens. And then a few years later, somebody writes a very similar article about why don't we revive these items of food. Okay, so we can see here the food's interesting because it's none of those farinaceous dishes. It's not a big pile of pasta. Nobody now thinks of a big pile of macaroni cheese, which was legitimately a savory item in a formal meal and listed as a savory. Nobody thinks of reviving macaroni cheese, right? Macaroni cheese is not in what people think of now as a savory. So here we have devil's and horseback, which is bacon wrapped prunes. We have some soft melts, so there's herring roes on toast. There's on the far right, we see some anchovies on scrambled eggs, which is Scotch woodcock. And I'm sure there's various different types of Welsh rabbit, because although Welsh rabbit existed at least 150 years before the savory course, it's considered to be a classic savory now. Now, interestingly, amongst all of this, we have this book by Theodoros Fitzgibbon, and she wrote this book. This book was published in 1983. So, and it's subtitled "A Taster Tradition." Savories had all but disappeared by the time that this book was published, and really it was trying to capture a sense of Englishness and tradition and quaintness and of times gone by and nostalgia. People bought this book, but there was no expectation, probably, that they would be serving a meal and putting the savory on the menu after the sweet course. So where we are now. So these are some items that absolutely qualify as savories. They're modern dishes. They are from various bars and restaurants that I've been to in Melbourne over the last year. And these completely qualify as savories. They're served in the manner of a savory. They're there to go with drinks. I mean, some of them are arguably a classic savory. So we have at the top, we have anchovies on toast with smoked tomato sorbet. If you take away the sorbet, then we have a dish that's been served for the last 400 years as something to go with alcohol. We have vol au vent. We have lots of things on crackers. These are all savories. We do not refer to, not a single one of these was referred to as a savory. So there's an issue here, is that this class of dishes still exists, but we just don't, they're not referred to as savories anymore, because savories have an old-fashioned, the word has an old-fashioned sort of feel to it. It sort of evokes, you know, dusty old gentlemen's clubs and a very exclusive elite experience. And people quite rightly do not want that. So although we have dishes which by all means qualify as a savory, they are definitely not savories. So what does that mean for when people talk about reviving the savories every few years? Let's revive the savory. Oh, we love savories. They're delicious. Why don't we eat savories anymore? Well, we have to, what do people actually mean by this? Because, you know, as I've spoken about through the course of this presentation, we're talking about a very complicated set of circumstances, and the meaning of savories means different things to different people at different times. Okay, so when people are talking about reviving savories, are they referring to resurrecting the savory course, having something savory after the dessert? Or do they just mean small snacky things to go with drinks, which we already have plenty of names for and has never gone away? Or do they mean a specific class of old-fashioned British things like Welsh rabbit, like Scotch woodcock, like deviled bones, that we should be bringing back into that sphere of drinking with drinks and rehabilitating them from sort of history? It's never clear what people are talking about here, and because there's so much confusion about the topic, a lot of people are when they say bringing back the savory course, they're actually talking about they don't particularly like eating sweets. So what they'd like to do is have is not to finish the meal on a sweet course, but to have something savory again, and that's fine. But that was never the intention of a savory or the savory course. But if people want to adapt these recipes and dishes in this way, I'm very open to it. But I think if we wanted to talk about resurrecting anything historical, then we really need to understand what that is. And at this point in history and time, I just don't think that even that people have a clear idea of what savories were and when they were served. So to summarize the talk, so really the savories, they developed in the mid-19th century, and there was a convergence of a number of different food history traditions. So, you know, we're talking about pre-19th century drinking habits and changing dining habits. You know, we had a range of these zests or piquant and spicy foods that were drinking foods. Many cultures have masculine drinking foods, from Asia to Europe. There are specific foods designed to be exclusively eaten only when drinking and drinking heavily. The change in service from Française to à la Russe actually created a space where women were now no longer excluded from these dishes. Not everybody was entirely happy about that, but it did prolong the popularity of these dishes. This strong association of savories with drinking culture resulted in a coupling of them to cocktail drinking or less formal drinking out with the savory course itself. And that really ended the savory course. It disappeared into the realm of some very elite exclusive dining, whereas savories with drinks and cocktails became so democratic that, you know, we were having supermarket cookbooks in Australia being published with them. But it all really ended, especially that formal savory course with the changes that came with the Second World War. So now we have savories, and they're still served. As I gave an example of sweetings, you can go and have savories at any number of restaurants in Britain, and especially London. So most of these restaurants are very established, and they're catering to the British and English establishment. But you do see savories appearing in quite modern and new restaurants just because they want to add that little cultural differentiation into their menu. So something a little bit English that differentiates their menu from all the other sort of standard modern menus around them. There's always a savory revival. It's always around the corner, but really I can't see a space for it because we already have these small snacky things to stimulate drinking already. And I can't see a space where some of these dishes come out of gentlemen's clubs and then suddenly appear on less formal menus. So I thought I would leave the discussion there and pose the question to you all, whether you could see a place for savories in a modern dining setting now. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will take questions now.